Good day, everyone. I am here to present my paper entitled The Rise of a Filipino in Fall, an autoethnographic research of a foreign language teacher. Before anything else, I'd like to give you a brief background first on the situation of Filipino language teaching and Fulbright scholarship. Now, every year, Fulbright Philippines selects young language teachers to go to the United States, specifically an academic institution, to study and teach Philippine language or Filipino or Tagalog and culture. Now, the process involves rigorous phases of document preparation, panel interview, and essay writing. Usually, it takes around 4 to 5 months before the entire process is being completed by a Fulbright scholar. What's very fascinating about this kind of program is that the scholar is actually given the opportunity to promote the language and serve as a cultural ambassador to the United States. On average, only around 3 to 5 scholars are chosen for the Fulbright Foreign Language Teaching Assistant Program, specifically here in the Philippines. And as I said, this program, the Foreign Language Teaching Assistant Program, is a 10-month non-degree scholarship at a U.S. academic institution. So basically, the purpose of this program is to provide platforms where an English language teacher, a Filipino English language teacher, can go to the United States, teach the Tagalog or the Filipino language, and share his or her culture to the American society. Now let's talk about the importance of being engaged with international exchange programs. The Alliance for International Exchanges in 2022 believes that international exchange programs create opportunities for participants to learn, to prosper, and to work with others to solve shared problems. This means to say that exchange programs are not just typical programs that students are fascinated about. It's actually one of the platforms where students, scholars, or even faculty members can engage themselves with international culture, where they can also establish stronger networks and linkages, and they can prosper academically and professionally speaking. I'd like to talk about, this time, the Filipino language teaching situation in the Lilac City. Now, Lilac City is another name for Spokane, which is a wonderful city situated in the Washington state of the United States of America. Now, only one university in the Spokane area offers a Filipino language program, and that is Gonzaga University, which is a Jesuit university situated at the heart of the Spokane area. And this Filipino language program is offered through a Fulbright FLTA scholarship. Filipino 101 is offered in the fall semester, while Filipino 102 is in the spring semester. Filipino 101 outlines topics including grammar, vocabulary, expressions, and culture, while 102 is a higher level where writing and speaking the language are the foci. So basically, students progress in terms of the level of difficulty of the language that they are learning, the target language, which is Filipino. So why am I very interested in the conduct of this research? Now, I had 3 research questions that I needed to answer in order for me to make sure that meaningful interpretations of data are made at the end of the research process. First one is, what are the Fulbright FLTA scholars' experiences of Filipino language teaching in terms of instruction? And since this is an autoethnographic research, the FLTA scholar here I'm referring to is actually myself, being the person who is experiencing the FLTA journey here in Spokane, Washington State. The second one is, what important notes on learning processes are documented by the Fulbright FLTA scholar? And third, I will be sharing about the perspectivization of the entire Fulbright FLTA experience. So the question is, how does the Fulbright FLTA scholar perspectivize his experiences of Filipino language teaching in the community? Now, for the methods, I actually use biographical, specifically autoethnographic research here because I believe that the use of narratives or stories can actually elicit necessary data in understanding a situation or a phenomenon or an experience. Now, in order for me to ensure that there is validity or reliability in terms of the data that I have gathered here, which are basically narratives or stories, I use several data collection techniques. First is the introspection, in which I reflected my own experiences on a daily basis. Second one, I also made observation with logs in order for me to have like journal entries to ensure that I would have something to read or to go back to by the time that I would have to make my interpretation of the research. And last would be the documentation process, where I included photo and video documentation, including the journal documentation through the diaries that I wrote in the entire process. And for the period, it actually covers August, October 2022, or 3/4 of the fall semester here in Gonzaga University. Now, for the analysis of the data, I used the thematic categorization of experiences and reflections, and I also anchor the entire analytic process to Hokanen's analysis of personal embodied experiences in 2017, in which the framework specifies that any experience is actually embodied by a certain person. And so when you analyze this one, you look very closely, very deeply into the experiences or the narrative accounts of the person under study. So in this case, it's actually myself being the FLTA scholars. Now let's talk about the findings of my research. And I'd like to focus first on the language teaching experiences that I had here in terms of instruction. First one, I would say that Filipino language teaching is kind of challenging. It's difficult, most especially for me, because when you go to the United States and teach the Filipino language, you would have to make sure that you introduce to them not only the language, but also the culture. And in relation to this, it is very important to be varied or differentiated in terms of the instruction that I am implementing in my class. That is why one of the emerging themes is variety and frequency, which highlights that as a Fulbright language teacher or a Fulbright language teaching assistant or a scholar, I would have to make sure that there is variety in terms of the instructional activities that I implement in class. And the more frequent these activities are implemented in the class, the more that they effectively learn the language and, of course, absorb the culture that I'm trying to emphasize in every class that I do. The second emerging theme is functionality and plurality. Although I needed to be prescriptive in terms of the Filipino language grammar that I teach them, it is also necessary for me to make sure that I emphasize to the entire class the importance of the functional use of language in society. This is where their pragmatic acknowledgement or recognition of when certain expressions or certain Filipino language statements are to be used in conversations or casual dealings with the people around them. Therefore, the intensification of this functionality aspect of language teaching is very important. And when you intensify these functional activities or the functional uses of language, it's also important that there is plurality. So we need to multiply also the frequency of the implementation of these different functional activities so that they would better appreciate when to use the language or when to use certain expressions in conversations or exchanges of discourses. The third theme is diversity and identity. In teaching language, culture is also significant. Therefore, it is very important that they also understand and embrace their own Filipino identity in their language. And that goes with the respect of the other cultures and the different societies that they interact with on a daily basis. Hence, diversity needs to be intensified as well in a Filipino language classroom. And it also goes with the acceptance of their own Filipino identity being in a Filipino language classroom. And the fourth theme is positivity and contextuality. Now, some of my learners are actually very hesitant in terms of the use of the target language, considering that they may be apprehensive to commit mistakes or to experience failure in language use. However, as a foreign language teacher, it is my role also to provide them that positive, safe space where they can use the target language without the fear of judgment or criticism. So, as a teacher, as a foreign language teacher, positivity is very important. And as what I said a while ago, functionality is significant. Hence, it is important that you also emphasize to them specific contexts on when to use this language, specific context as to when they can try to be as social as they can in terms of language use and as formal as they can in terms of the use of the Filipino language. That way, they could have a distinction between the formal and the informal use of the Filipino language in society. Now, aside from the different experiences that I have pertaining to instruction, I would like to highlight also the different learning processes that my students experience inside the classroom. So these are some of my observations with regard to how they learn the Filipino language. First one, I could see that there is a dilemma between identity and apathy. Many of these learners are actually embracing the Filipino culture that they have. That's why they decided to enroll in a Filipino language classroom. However, there would really be times when they feel apathetic or passive about the language learning process itself. Maybe because the mother tongue interference is there. Sometimes the use of the English language interferes with the use of the target language. So they oftentimes experience difficulties in producing sounds, in exchanging conversations, or being engaged with their fellow classmates or learners in dialogues or discourses. And this actually causes this apathy that they're experiencing in a language classroom. The second one is the problem between independence and reliance. Well, naturally, these students, American learners, are actually very independent when it comes to learning processes. However, when they started learning Filipino language, I observed that they needed to rely more on me being their foreign language teacher. And so most of the time, I would have to supplement their learning processes with the giving of feedback and also with the giving of input that are ought to be very necessary in the context of their language learning process. The third one is the identification of the barriers between being a teacher or being a brother inside a classroom setting. Well, most of these learners are apprehensive in learning the foreign language or the Tagalog language or the Filipino language. However, when you try to connect with them in a way that they feel like you're being a family to them and that you're introducing the culture in the most authentic way as possible, then they would have no hesitation in participating inside the classroom and in using the target language. And what's very fascinating is that when they feel like they are connected to you being their teacher, they become more open, they become more dynamic and enthusiastic in terms of language learning. That is why I do not allow my students actually to call me by my title or by the title or the name Sir Michael or whatsoever. I just ask them to call me Kuya Michael because I think that's the best way for them to connect well with me as their teacher. And so authentic conversations can be sparked or can be started inside the classroom setting. And the last is convention versus innovation. Sometimes there are problems with how the learning processes are also provided to the students. If I were this conventional teacher, I would have to stay only inside the classroom and make sure that my students are within the bounds of my classroom and are listening attentively to my discussions. However, I needed to be innovative. I needed to be very dynamic. And so I also allow my students to be engaged in different learning environments. For example, going outside the classroom or being in another setting such as a restaurant or a campus area where we can freely engage ourselves in authentic use of the Filipino language. This way, they can feel that I am not being conventional in terms of the teaching, learning process, and that I am actually providing them a bigger space where they can express themselves more effectively in terms of Filipino language use. Now, it's also very important to take into consideration the personal embodied experiences that I have as an FLTA scholar here. And so I would like to share my insights on teaching Philippine language and culture in the Lilac City here in Spokane, Washington. First one, I believe that self-projection of the actual instruction is very important. And when I say self-projection, what I mean is my ability to make sure that I am actually embracing the culture myself. I should start within myself before I can convince my learners to learn Filipino language and to embrace the Filipino culture. And so that Filipino-ness or my own identity being a Filipino will help a lot and can be convincing also in a way, instrumental in order for me to persuade my students to love the Filipino language or culture even more. And so self-projection is very important. Second one is innovation and variation in language education, is what I mentioned a while ago. As a foreign language teacher, I need to be dynamic and enthusiastic. And so being innovative, varied, or differentiated with the kind of instruction that I provide my learners can really help a lot. And so I have been doing this since the start of my classes here in the United States, and I have observed that it has really helped a lot in making sure that my students are provided with the best learning opportunities that they can have inside my classroom. And third one is connection for effective pedagogical relation. I think it's very important to always emphasize to the students that they are given a safe platform where they can express themselves. And that language classroom environment that you give them is a tool enough to say that they are given this space that you are trying to emphasize to them. Intensifying to them the kind of connection or the relation that you have with them is also one good way to establish that rapport for language learning process. And once that rapport is achieved, it will be easier for you to make sure that they have active engagement in the language learning process per se. At the same time, they would have an easy time, the most convenient time for them to process the language learning itself, the language learning process itself. So why personal stories in Filipino language teaching? Many of us might be asking, why is there a need for me to write a research about this one? Or what makes this research interesting? Well, autoethnographic narratives provide primary data that project much more meaningful interpretations of experiences. So when you write autoethnographic research, you are not just writing stories or narratives or dictations. You are actually writing stories that represent the situation or the experiences or the encounters of a person in a given community or in a given situation. And considering that I'm an FLTA scholar here, taking into account the different experiences that I have here since I started my journey here as a Fulbright scholar is very important also to shed light to those who might have like interests in applying for an FLTA program scholarship. Stories also spark more interest and teach a lot about situations, life world, and transitions. And understanding this life world can also be very significant in order for us to wear the shoes of these people around us. Now, in my case, and in your case, to wear my shoes as an FLTA scholar and to wear the shoes of other international exchange students who are engaged in the teaching of a foreign language as well. And lastly, this paper can give ideas on how the Fulbright FLTA program can be improved, how future international faculty scholars can adjust to pedagogical changes given the community or societal adjustments, and what considerations need to be observed in teaching Filipino to multilingual and foreign learners. And as a Fulbright scholar myself, now here in the United States, I think that the program itself has so much to improve in the next years to come. And I think that the continuity of this program will help a lot, most especially those Filipino language scholars who are thinking of applying for this program and allowing themselves to really immerse in the community and experience the program itself. And this kind of research will surely give them ideas on what to expect, what to adjust, and what to change the moment that they are already in their host institutions. That's all for my presentation. Maraming salamat po and magandang araw.